functionality of it and how you can use it and leverage it to learn more about Cypress best practices and to take those into your own applications and your own test suites. So the GitHub repository for this app is at cypress.io/Cypress Real World App. And so this is the actual GitHub repository where you can see all the code, you can clone it, and you can pull it down to get it installed. All right, and then just so we can get started. So like I said, I'm Cecelia. I'm a success engineer at Cypress. I've been there since January. I'm from Atlanta. Well, I'm in Atlanta from all over. Here now, love it, love the city. I do some volunteer work. I am a track evangelist for women who code front end. And I'm also on the leadership team for Out in Tech, which supports LGBTQIA+ people in the tech industry. And I helped found the Atlanta chapter of Out in Tech. You can find me online on Twitter, GitHub at Cecelia Creates. Usually the best way to find me in general on Twitter or on GitHub. If you do have any questions about the Real World app, please feel free to create issues in the app. It is open source. It's meant to be a collaborative tool for everyone to use. And you can also always reach me on Twitter if you have anything specific as well. Okay, so why the Real World app? Why did Cypress go ahead and make this application? So it was essentially designed to showcase real-world usage of Cypress testing methods, patterns, and workflows. It is a payment application similar to Venmo, Cash App, PayPal, essentially, where you can send and receive transactions to friends and then also add bank accounts, update your profile, authentication, a lot of the same functionality that exists in applications that you see in production. It was designed to be able to clone, install, and run the app without needing any additional dependencies or native components. It's meant to help you get up and running quickly and seeing how Cypress works in a real-world situation. And like I said, it's meant to allow you to learn, experiment, tinker, and practice using Cypress and different applications and ways that you can use it. So Marie did mention the tech stack, so we're going to dive into that next. The Real World app is built with React on the front end. It uses a library called XState to manage the state of the application. So rather than using something like Redux or a different type of data store, we're using XState to manage that in the front end of our application. It does have an Express backend that handles the API. And the database is managed with LoadDB. It's essentially a library that allows us to utilize a flat file JSON database. That way, and the reason for that, again, is that you don't have to build up your own database in order to run the application. We're using the Material UI component library for the design. And then it also does use TypeScript. So if your application uses TypeScript, you can see how to test a TypeScript application with Cypress and what that entails. And we'll definitely be talking a little bit about that as well. So the app functionality, it does a lot of different things. Like I said, it's similar to, this is what it looks like when you log in. It's similar to a Venmo Cash App, where essentially you have bank accounts that you add, you can search for friends, and you can create transactions. So if we take a look at what the app can do and how it's similar to a lot of real world production applications, you have the similar kind of challenges that you would experience. You have the authentication, making sure that the user can sign up, log in, and log out. You have onboarding, making sure they're able to initially get set up with the app, create their profile, and whatever steps need to be done in order to get them set up. You add and delete bank accounts, create transactions, accept or reject transaction requests. You can like and comment on transactions. You can view transactions between friends, different categories of transactions. You can update your profile. And you can also view and dismiss notifications. So we're going to talk a lot about all this different functionality, what that looks like in the app, and ways that you can test for this. So rather than click through everything and show you, I wanted to essentially, we generated this demo video using the cypress-movie plugin. It is available at this repository here. The way that it works is essentially, it's a way to leverage Cypress to do product demos or to demonstrate applications by automatically running through the functionality. So that is what this video is. So we can take a look and see here. Maybe I can make it full screen so it's mostly visible. But so the application allows you to sign up a user. So it goes through a normal, essentially, sign up process that looks very familiar. You can then log in. It goes through the user onboarding. So with the onboarding, you create a bank account initially and you get set up. It allows you to add additional bank accounts if you need to. And again, these are not real bank accounts, not real users, not real transactions. It's meant to be demonstrative. You can delete bank accounts. And then this is kind of the meatiest part of the app, is submitting a new transaction. This is the main functionality, and confirming that the transactions have gone through. Like I said before, you can accept requests, and you can also reject transaction requests. And then you can react to transactions. So you can like and you can add comments. And then you can view transactions from your everyone, friends, and also personal transactions. You can update your profile. You can view and dismiss notifications, just like how you would in a lot of different applications. And of course, you can log out. So those are the core functions of the application and what that looks like. And again, this was generated with cypress-movie plugin. What this does is it slows down the speed of the test run so that you can see everything that's going on. It also allows adds in extra commands that removes the command log so you don't see the test running on the side. And then it also gives you that functionality to add the toast in the bottom and add the arrows that you saw throughout the demo video. So definitely recommend also checking that out. It is it's also open source, and please feel free to create any issues on that repository. And that's also included here, this link in the application too, that goes to the repo here, cypress-movie. All right, so that's what the application does. So let's talk about how it's built, what the code looks like. So next we're going to be going through the installation, file organization, configuration, and then, actually using the application, what you would need to get it set up. So like we said, we wanted it to be as simple and easy as possible to be able to clone, install, and run this app. So once you clone the repository from GitHub, you can just kind of pull it down using SSH or HTTPS. And then you just run yarn install, then you run yarn dev, and this actually starts up the application. And then in a new terminal, you would run yarn cypress open to open the test runner. And then once the test runner is open, you can start clicking through all the existing tests and see how they work. Taking a look at the file organization, a couple of things I wanted to point out. So in our cypress.json folder, the way that normally whenever you install Cypress, the default test folder is called integration. It's your integration folder. That's where all the tests are held. In this case, because we have both UI and API tests, the integration folder that name doesn't quite make as much sense. So it's changed to tests. So we do have to designate that our integration folder is cypress/tests. You don't have to do this. It's already been done. I just wanted to point it out because you may have a similar situation where you have a different name for your test folder, and this is how you would update that. And so the folder structure within the Cypress looks pretty similar if you're familiar with Cypress already. You have your fixtures, your plugins, your support folder, which contains your commands, your index file, and then also we have some utilities. And then we have our test folder, which contains the API and the UI. So to give this a look in VS Code here, I have the font as big as possible. So we can see that we have within our Cypress folder, our fixtures. This is as a result of cypress-movie. We have our plugins, our support, and then our tests. And within our tests, we have our API tests and our UI tests. And I did see a question about NPM. So this does use yarn. You can still start Cypress using npx Cypress. However, yarn allows you to just kind of get started and running really quickly. So cypress.json, the configuration folder file. Again, you don't have to make any changes here. Again, you can just pull on the repo, yarn install, yarn dev, and start using the application. But I did want to point out some things here that may be helpful in your own projects and to show what's working behind the scenes. So we do have our, our base URL set up. This is a best practice across all Cypress projects, is to designate the URL where your application is running, so you don't have to type it in manually across your app. Like I mentioned before, we've reset our integration folder to be Cypress/tests. And then we also have the API URL for our backend. This is a localhost 3001. So when you run yarn dev, it starts the front and back end of your application all with one command. And this is how we designate where those two parts of our application are running. So I did want to also mention this app is built with TypeScript. So we do have to add types for any kind of custom commands that we run in Cypress. There is a global.ts file within the Cypress folder that contains all of the types. This is just a subset of some of them, but I wanted to showcase these. There are 3 different types of custom login commands, and we can see what it looks like when we are defining the types for TypeScript. So in this case, the parameters that are being accepted for login by API is a username, which is a string. It may also contain a password, which would be a string, and then it returns a response. Login by XState, again, a username that's a string, may contain a password that's a string, and that is a return of any type. And then logout by XState does not have any parameter types, and then it just returns void because it doesn't have an actual return value. So again, going back into VS Code, we can see in our global.d.ts file, that's tough to say, that this is where we define any and all of our custom command types for Cypress. So if you need to leverage custom commands within your own TypeScript application, this is an example of how you could essentially define those. So again, we have our login by API. And then we do have some additional scripts in the package.json that I wanted to point out. So if you did want to start the application not in watch mode, so if you wanted to start it, but you're not going to be making any changes, you can just run yarn start. There's also a db seed command, which will seed your database. This command actually runs automatically every time you start the application, and also in between every test. And we'll be talking a lot about the data management of this application. So start empty is if you wanted to start the application with no database seeding. So this would essentially start it without any of that data in place. And then list dev users is a command that essentially shows the usernames that you can use to log into the application. Speaking of logging in, there is a user list in data/database.json or database-seed.json. If you have never actually run the application, then you won't have a database that's been seeded yet, but you can get that data from database seed. This will show all the usernames that you can use to log in. The default password for everyone is secret with a 3. And we can see that here in our data. So we have our database seed.json here that contains all of our users. Okay, so we talked about why the app exists. We talked a little bit about the file structure, the organization, and getting started with it. I want to spend a good amount of time talking about the testing approach, because the purpose of this application is to show best practices, and a lot of those best practices are represented in how we decided to organize and structure our tests and how we decided to manage the data of the application. So the Real World app does have API, UI, and unit tests. The API and the UI tests are both managed by Cypress, and then the unit tests are run in Jest. So for the API tests were helpful in validating the back end before building the front end as we were developing this application, or as our developer experience team was developing this application. And API tests with Cypress don't always make sense. It depends on when you're running the tests. In this case, because we're already spinning up a browser to run the UI tests, we can use Cypress for the API tests as well. And we also wanted to demonstrate what this looks like, because we do get questions from people who ask if we can use Cypress for API testing, and this is how you essentially would do that in real life. So it uses sci.request to make requests and then make assertions on the response. And like I said, it makes sense to use Cypress for API tests in this case because we're spinning up a browser anyway. So what it looks like, I'm going to kind of show here for the API tests. If we take a look at bank account, they look pretty straightforward. So essentially we have a context for each of our request types, and then we also have the endpoint. Essentially it's making a side.request to that endpoint with the request type, and then it's just making assertions on the response. So for example, in this case, we wanted to get a list of bank accounts for the user. It's making a call to that API endpoint, and then it's the response, we're asserting that the status came through correctly and that the body is equal to the user ID is equal to the user ID that we are expecting. So this is the function and the format for using Cypress for API testing. And again, this is just a kind of a more of a specific breakdown. So like we said, we get to list of the user bank accounts, makes a request to the endpoint, and then it makes an assertion on the response. So the UI tests, they're designed around the user views of the application. So for example, the containers in the app are broken down for bank account container, notifications container, and you can see that the UI tests, the spec files, match up pretty similarly with what we're seeing with the test. And that was designed essentially because the user views of the application are going to mimic the user journeys and the user stories, and that's how the UI tests are designed. So we have long tests along critical paths within those views. So for example, in our API users, user spec, there's a should allow a visitor to sign up, log in, and log out. We can take a look at that here in our auth spec. So this is a very kind of long critical path test. It should allow a visitor to sign up, log in, and log out. And we see we're setting up essentially the user info, but we're having them sign in, go through the entire process manually, log in, going through the onboarding process that we saw in the video where they add a bank account, and then it also logs them out. So this is an example of of a long user journey of a critical path that we need to make sure all of these pieces are working. There are also unit tests. So like I said, these are within the source folder, this underscore tests, and then you can run them separately on their own. You can either do yarn test unit or yarn test unit CI, which runs the test without watch mode. So if you're running them in your CI, you don't have watch mode open because you're not making any changes. Okay, so that's the approach that we took to writing the test, to designing the test, and to essentially building up the test suite for the application. A big part of testing, additionally, is also data management. And that's something that we wanted to demonstrate with the real world application because we get a lot of questions about this. And it is having the right data in your testing environment can be a big challenge for people who write tests because it's not always linked exactly to production, but we need a certain caliber of data in order to be able to run our tests accurately. So we're going to talk a little bit about the approach, how we handle database seeding. We do have an API endpoint just for test data. So I wanted to talk a lot about that. And then also talk about how we leverage test data within our test code. So once we've seeded our database, once we have it set up, how do we actually get that data into our test code so that we can make assertions? So our approach, like I mentioned before, we have a local JSON database managed with LoadDB. So what does this look like in our test code? So we have a backend, and this is essentially our API. And then we have data. And this is our database. It's just a JSON folder. It contains our users. It contains transactions. It contains quite a bit of data. All this data exists before the application starts. We're not forcing this data to exist by running certain transactions. We're essentially, all this data is pre-existing, but it's set up in a way that allows us to do good tests. But it's all done within the database.json. We're just writing to JSON. We don't have to spin up, like a SQL database or a MongoDB instance, or anything like that in order to be able to run the application. So the database is reseeded when the app is started and in between each Cypress test. So you have fresh data for every single test. Like I said before, the data is generated in advance of the application running. It's based on the data is generated based on business logic of the application in this seed data utility script. So what that looks like is in our scripts folder, we have the seed data utilities. What this is doing, it's actually leveraging the business logic to create certain types of relationships between data objects that we need and to make good tests. So for example, if a user needs to have 5 transactions that we can, reject 1, accept 2, dismiss 3, this is done in advance without having to make those relationships ad hoc. So if you feel like taking a look at what that looks like, creating fake users, creating fake transactions, this is how we handle it in the Cypress Real World app. So the purpose of this is that there's no need to create that business logic within the test. So you don't have to create 5 transactions in order to be able to accept 1 or reject 1. You don't need to just create notifications in order to be able to dismiss them. This is all done in advance. It may not be the best approach for all data models, right? So we have a pretty straightforward data model. It's a pretty simple application, and it was specifically designed to be able to do this. But depending on your data model, it may not always be possible for you to create specific data, but it is essentially a best practice. And if the goal is to keep the test code as clear and simple as possible, which is what this app is designed to do. Things point by point. So there is a sci.task. So what sci.task does is it actually runs a command in your terminal. It allows you to access that from within your test code. So I mentioned earlier that there's additional scripts. One of them which is db seed, which will seed your database. That's the exact same script that we're using here. So it can be run in your terminal as a command, or we can leverage sci.task to run the command for us in our terminal from within our test code. So we have a sci.task db seed in a before each hook that runs between every test. So if we take a look at any test, so we can see here, there's a before each function, and sci.task db seed is right here. So before every single test, it's reseeding the database. So what does that command do? So in our plugins index.ts file, this function is defined. So we say on task db seed, it's going to go ahead and make a post request to an endpoint. And this endpoint is test data API endpoint, and it's the seed. And so essentially we're going to make a post request to that endpoint and wait for it to return. So what does that endpoint do, right? So this is a command that makes a post request to the endpoint saying, please seed the database. So what is this test data endpoint, right? So we have a endpoint specifically designed only for test data. Its only purpose is to provide data for tests. So it's in our backend with all of our other API endpoints, and it's a test data routes.ts is the name of the file. Within there, we're defining the endpoint for seed. When it receives a post request, it runs this seed database command. So again, just kind of connecting the line that what happens. We have the db seed command that runs in our terminal between every test. That command is making a post request to our API endpoint. Our API endpoint is then running this seed database function. So what does the seed database function do? Great question. So within our database.ts file, again, still in our backend, we have the function declared here. So seed database It's essentially just using Node to write to our JSON file. So it is getting this, it's taking the seed data and it's just writing it to database seed.json here. So it's db.setState. It's writing it with the test seed and returning the data. So every time that that db seed command is running, it's making a post request to our API endpoint. Our API endpoint is running the seed database command, which then is using Node to actually write the file of our database seed JSON. And then once it takes that, it's setting our database to that seeded data to make it match up consistently. Okay, so last but not least, so we have this database. We have this database that's being seeded in between every transaction, or I'm sorry, in between every test that we have good data to test on. So how do we use that data? How do we bring that data into our test code? We do that with a couple of custom commands for querying our JSON database. So within support/command, so if you haven't used custom commands before, what it allows you to do is essentially write a function that adds a command so you can run sci.database or sci.whatever the command is. So if you had a command for logging in, you know, sci.login, you can use that in your test code and then it will run this function. So in this case, we have a sci.database command that we're adding. What it's doing is that it's creating essentially a sci.task command that will run a command in our terminal. And that command is going to be an operation type and then database. So again, whenever we do sci.date, so we would do sci.database and then we put operation find, and then we have the query parameters. What's going to happen is in sci.task is then going to call find database, pass through the parameters, and run that command. Diving a little bit deeper, so this is what those tasks actually do. So if we were to run filter database, it's going to run a command that queries the database with the payload and returns the response. Again, we also have a find database command. So going back up, again, just tracing the line here, we run sci.database, we push through the operation, which in this case, let's say it's find, and we pass through the query. That's going to run this find database command, which is going to query the database and return the payload. And then this is just a breakdown of what that query database function is doing, which again, it's leveraging our test data API endpoint in order for us to query our data and get that back. Again, only used in our test environment. And so what this looks like when we talk about actually using it in our test. Oh, it's one right here. So this is an example. So in our test code, we have sci.database. We're passing through find, and we're passing through the query, which is users. So again, if we were to follow that, then what's going to happen is then we're going to run that find database, and then the query payload is going to be users. We're going to then make a call to our API endpoint with the users filled in for that parameter, and that's going to return the data that we need for our test. Okay, so we talked a lot about data, and we talked about a little bit about custom commands. So I just demonstrated how custom commands work, essentially where you define them in your commands.ts file by writing a function, and then you can use that command anywhere in your test code. There are some additional custom commands that are generated within the Real World app. Two that I would recommend using in your own app is sci.getByCell, or getBySelector is what it stands for, and sci.getByCell-like. I didn't include the entire function, but essentially what this command does is it allows you to use whatever the data attribute is that you have set for your HTML. So one of the best practices for Cypress is to use data attributes on your elements to query, rather than necessarily trying to query from a class or an ID or some kind of arbitrary text. If you have access to your code base and you're able to set it up this way, using either like data test or data sci as also how it's used in our documentation, you can just, instead of having to type that out every single time, like you can see here, if you had to type out sci.get data test equals and then the selector, that could be time consuming. So in this case, we're just doing get by cell, and you're passing through whatever the selector is. So if you know that it's, back button, you just have to type in back button. You don't have to type in the entire attribute. The counterpart to this is get by cell like, which essentially it's like a wildcard match. So where this is helpful is, for example, in the application, if you wanted to grab the first dismiss button for the notifications, every notification has a specific ID. So its data sci or its data test might look like, like notification, dismiss, transaction ID, and it has like a long ID number. You don't need to type in that entire thing. You just need to get, dismiss notification, that part of the selector. So that's when you would use get by cell like, when you essentially only need to match a portion of that data attribute and not the entire thing. So I would recommend using similar commands in your own applications if you're leveraging this data attribute model, because it reduces the amount of typing or copy and pasting, if you're like me, that you have to do. Some other custom commands. So we have some login commands. I wanted to point these out because essentially it's three different ways to log in. So we have sci.login, which takes a username and a password, and then a Boolean of whether it's remembering a user or not. And this actually is a manual login. So it goes to the login screen, it types in the username, types in the password, either checks the box or not, and it logs them in. So as you can see, if you were doing this a lot, typing out all of those steps would be time consuming. So instead we define it once and we use it throughout the application. There's also an option to log in by API. This is leveraged in our API tests. Takes in a username and password, and it actually makes a call to our API to log in our user in the database. And then, to log in via our server. And then there's also sci.login by xstate. So this is leveraged in our UI tests, where we don't necessarily care if the API is actually being updated. We really just want to set a certain state of logged in order to be able to test UI functionality. So that's what this is doing. It's accessing the xstate, which is, again, it's the state management tool of the application, and it's logging in a user within that state, so within the front end. So again, this is leveraged heavily in our UI. So there's three different ways to log in, depending on what we want to test. If we're testing our API, we want to make sure that we can actually log in with the API. If we want to make sure that the login functionality is working manually, we would want to use the sci.login to run through every step. And then again, if we're not testing the login functionality, but we need to log somebody in order to be able to test other things, then we can use login by xstate, because essentially all we really need to do is just say, yes, this person is logged in, now please let me do my other tests. And again, these are all defined within the support commands.ts. And you can create custom commands for anything you want. I mean, it's JavaScript, it's Node essentially. And so you can leverage these however, whatever works best for your application. So if you have a certain type of functionality that is done a lot, that may be time consuming to actually click through each step, then you may think, you know what, I don't actually need to have the person, or to have the user in this case, click through each step. Why don't I just use our state management tool and mark them as logged in? Or, if I do want them to click through to make sure everything is working, but we need to do that maybe 10 different times throughout our tests, using a command like sci.login, which will go through the steps, but you don't have to type them out each time. There are also a couple of transaction commands. So we do have create transaction, which essentially is taking in a payload and making a call to our API to create that transaction. Set transaction amount range. So these are can be helpful to take a look at if you need an example of kind of creating this type of data for your tests. And then we also have some navigation function commands. So next transaction feed page. So this actually, if you have in your transaction feed, because it scrolls, and just kind of getting to the next section of that page. And then there's also a pick date range. So there's a date picker on our application, which as any date picker goes, having to click into everything and, pick the start date and the end date can be time consuming and tricky to do manually. So this command is leveraged throughout the test in order where all we need is a start date and an end date. and then it will go through and it'll click through and it'll set the date range and pick that with the date picker in our application. So I'd highly recommend using custom commands in your own test suite just to save yourself time. It's, don't repeat yourself, right? It's the same kind of thing that you use for programming. If you find yourself typing out the same commands over and over and over again, can those be instead changed to a custom command? All right, so talked about why the app, we talked about the functionality of the app, we talked about the testing, how the app works, what the code base looks like. We talked about the testing approach and the data management of the testing. I really wanted to spend a lot of time on that section because that's something that we see a lot of questions around. Another thing we see a lot of questions around is continuous integration. So if you are running your tests, with a test runner, you're used to that. Okay, now I want my tests to run automatically every time I do a pull request, or every time I do, if I want to check them nightly, or if I'm going to do smoke tests, however, whatever approach you take, getting your tests set up in your CI is also something that we see a lot of questions around. So we demonstrate that with the real world application. So the real world application uses Circle CI for the CI provider. That configuration is in the Circle CI config.yml file. It uses the Cypress orb. So the Cypress orb for Circle CI essentially just contains whatever dependencies that you need to run Cypress in your CI. It also uses a Cypress Docker image. So we have a number of Docker images available that contain all the dependencies for Cypress. And then we also have the option to include the Cypress binary as well for that Docker image. It has workflows for Linux and Windows. And it runs the unit, API, and the UI tests, including mobile viewport version on Chrome, Firefox, and Windows. So let's take a look at this configuration file. So as we can see, it's using some orbs here. So we have the Cypress orb, we have a code coverage orb, and then we have a Windows orb too. And then again, here we're using the Docker image, the Node version, and the Chrome 83. We have a couple of commands, and this is essentially where we're defining what these commands mean. And then these are our workflows. So we have the Linux workflow, which will run some of our tests, the Chrome and Firefox. The nice thing about this config file is it does have the comments to show what we're doing in each step. So we're essentially, we're setting up the Linux, we're installing Cypress, we're running the API test first against the backend server. I'm sorry. We're running the unit tests, we're running the API tests with Chrome and Firefox, and then here's where we start to run our end-to-end tests. So we're running them in Chrome. We're running them in Chrome with mobile device viewport. We're running them in Firefox, and then again in Firefox with mobile device viewport. Then we start up our Windows workflow, and what this is to run the tests in Electron. So then again here we're running our UI tests in Electron or Windows, in order to be, and this executor comes from the Windows orb. So if you have any questions about getting it set up in CI, Circle CI, like I said, it has the orb built in already. It's a great way to get started, but those configuration files with the comments can be helpful for looking for certain commands, because a lot of the the configuration files for different CIs are similar, at least the ones that use the configuration file instead of a UI-based setup. And so the Real World app does also connect to the Cypress dashboard so that the tests that run in CI are recorded to the dashboard. It is a public project, so you can access the runs at any time. If you wanted to view screenshots, videos, or output of failed runs, you can sort runs by branch status, committer, time range, and tags. And you can also view analytics like run duration and test suite size. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Cypress dashboard, it is an optional add-on service for the test runner that essentially it's a dashboard that allows you to log in and view test results and do have some more advanced kind of debugging and analytics features, as well as CI features like running in parallel. So, but if you wanted to get a look at what the breakdown of the runs for the Real World app, this is where you could see them. So I talked a little bit about responsive testing when I was going through the configuration file for Circle CI, you'll see that we do run the tests with a mobile viewport set. So there's no separate UI tests for mobile. Within our UI tests, there is a is mobile check for certain tests that would require us to click on a different menu. So the view is going to be a little bit different when it's set to mobile viewport. But we didn't need to break out mobile tests or desktop tests. We are able to leverage the same test suite just by setting the viewport width and viewport height to force the browser to run in that mobile view. So there are two commands that you can use to run the test locally. There is Cypress Open Mobile, which essentially is just Cypress Open, but it's setting the configuration so the viewport width and the viewport height are mobile. And then there's Cypress Run Mobile, which does the same thing, but it's in run mode, so it won't open the test runner. And this is the same command that you can use for CI. And again, this is just showing the configuration file for our Circle CI that's showing that we're running them in groups. So I wanted to point out here, so we have the spec is the same. It's just test/UI. There's no separate mobile tests. We have the configuration set. And then we also are grouping. So we have a name, so it's UI Chrome Mobile. The reason that we do this is that in the Cypress dashboard, the specs are broken up into these groups. So we can see we have our API grouping, we have our UI Chrome grouping, and we have here our UI Chrome Mobile. So we can quickly see, okay, is it a certain browser that's failing? Is it the mobile viewport that's causing a failure? By grouping our tests like this and separating them out based on those different environments and based on the viewport type, whether it's mobile or desktop, allows us to hone in on where certain errors might be if we do experience a test failure. Okay, code coverage. So what is code coverage? If you're not familiar with it, essentially there's two approaches to testing or to validating the effectiveness of your test suite. There's code coverage and then there's case coverage. So case coverage is when you think of your user stories or your test cases. So if I think, what are the core functions that I want my user to be able to do? What are the paths that they follow? What are their user journeys? Those are your test cases. And then essentially you want to make sure that your test cases cover those situations. Another metric that you can use is code coverage. And what this measures is how much of my code base is being touched when my tests run. So when you run your tests, if you never ever touch like the notifications part of your code base, for example, that's what code coverage would help illustrate. Or if you run your tests and you are testing, your sign up function way more than you need to, maybe like substantially more than you need to, then maybe you say, you know what, I don't need them to manually log in for every command. I can just set it up in state. That way, and it'd be more efficient for the testing because we're already testing our login function several times. That's what code coverage reports help you do. It helps you kind of have that approach for it. So code coverage versus case coverage, both are very important. So we use the Cypress Code Coverage plugin. Again, this link here takes you to the repository, and it essentially helps you instrument your code, which, like I said, essentially it instruments your code in a certain way so that when your tests run, it can see what part of the code base is being touched. So if you wanted to generate a report, you can do yarn cypress run and then set the environment of coverage to true. By default, it's set to false. And then you can view generated reports in the coverage folder. Essentially, it generates an index.html file, which has your code coverage report. For the real world app, you can also view the code coverage report. Looks like we have 100% coverage right now, and it looks like it's we have backend and source, so it is broken down into those the front end and the back end of our application. So we can see right now we have 100% code coverage with our tests. This is going to be a really good metric for you to see, to highlight any gaps that maybe we need to evaluate our test cases. Are we, have we written enough test cases? Is there, or not, or are we over testing in certain areas? And then just to point out that there is a codecov configuration file, and what our essentially requirements are to pass in CI is that the coverage is between 90 and 100, or I guess at least 90. with the precision of 2. So if we were to run our test and only have a code coverage of 87%, then that would fail. That would not allow it to proceed. All right, so we talked about quite a bit of things, and I wanted to spend some time and just kind of review those before we move into questions. So we talked about why the real world apps exist, why Cypress built it, what the purpose of it was. We talked about the tech stack, how to install it, the file structure, and how to use the app. We talked about the testing approach for the real world app and how you can use that to inform your own testing approach for your own applications. Talked about test data management and using test data. This is definitely one of the biggest topics that I hear about from our users. And so I would definitely recommend taking a look at some of the different script sets around how data management is done in the real world application. Talked about custom commands, responsive testing, and then also continuous integration, and finally code coverage. So there's a lot there. I don't expect you to remember all of it. I don't either. So we have some resources that I want to share, and I am going to make these slides are available. They're public, so you can review them at any time. But there's a link to the Cypress Real World app on GitHub, the Cypress Dashboard for the Real World app, the code coverage report. There's also a video that I found on YouTube, which I really liked. It's a Cypress Real World app setup and walkthrough. So it shows how to install the app. It goes through some of the different file structures that we talked through today, if you prefer that method. And then there's also the blog post that we made when we introduced the Cypress Real World app as well, that talks through some of the different features and functionalities. All right, so I believe it's time to move on to some questions. And I think that we have quite a few, so I'm excited to dive in here. So I'm going to take a look at, I think, Marie, if it's okay just for me to start pulling some questions from Slido. It looks like there's, oh, look, people can vote on them. That is cool. So let me take a look at some of these here. What is the best practice design pattern for Cypress? Okay, so page object design like Selenium, or is there a good example we can reference? Yeah, so this is actually a really, really great question. Let me find, so there is nothing preventing you from using page object model in Cypress. You can absolutely do it if that works for your application, if that makes sense for you as a QA team or an engineering team. So, but there is a really great blog post. Let me see if here it is, that I want to share, and I can post this in the chat. It was written by Gleb, who is our VP of engineering at Cypress. It talks about it says stop using page objects and start using app actions. So again, you can use page objects if that's what works well for you. There's nothing in Cypress that's preventing you from doing that. Again, it's JavaScript, you can set it up that way. However, we kind of recommend talking about the actions of your application. And again, going back to like, what is your user doing in your app? What do they need to be able to do? What's going to be important for them to be able to do well and have it not break? So if you're an e-commerce website, you really need to make sure that the user can go to an object or go to an item, add it to their cart, check out, complete the purchase process, right? Because if anything on that path is broken, then your app is broken, right? People can't buy things. That's what it's designed to do. So we talk about this approaching testing from that perspective of what is your actual user journey through the application. And that's when we talk about the case coverage, right? Like, are your tests covering all of those cases that your user goes through, in addition to the code coverage, which is a more kind of technical application of, is all of our code base being touched when we run our tests? So so this is essentially a good way. I recommend taking a look at this blog post. So if you aren't specifically tied to page objects and you're looking for a good mental model or framework for approaching tests, then this can be a really helpful blog post to that as well. And then I am seeing some questions. I will be sending the presentation slides. I can actually just do this right now. And I'll send the link out in just a little bit because I'm not sure that's the best. That's like the accessible link. So yes, I will be sending out the slides as well. And then so that's my answer as far as page objects. We get this question a lot, and people love using page objects. I would say if that works well for you, if that's a really good mental model for how you design your tests. And the other caveat of that is if you have good test and code coverage, then that's great. Like in my opinion, as long as the outcomes are what you need them to be, and it gives you the confidence that you need in order to be able to have a successful application, then if you like using a certain way to do that, that's fine. If you're not sure, if you need some guidance, if you're looking for some advice, I definitely recommend checking out that blog post. So for API testing, can we test the schema instead of the data inside the response? Yeah, it's a really good question. So kind of just want to make sure that I'm understanding properly. So when you're talking about the schema, essentially you're talking about the structure of the response as opposed to the data inside the response. So when you think about what the response looks like, for example, if it is a object, right? If it's like a JavaScript object that has certain properties that you're expecting, you can make assertions on that. So for example, if you had I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but if you had a response and you know it's supposed to be an object and you know that it's supposed to have like a username, a password, and certain properties, then you could make assertions on whatever the response is to assert that structure of the object is what you expected. So yeah, that would definitely be possible as well. Okay, have you had experience using Cypress to test GraphQL queries and mutations? Yes, so this is a really, really, really good question. It is possible. There are some workarounds that are needed. There's a GitHub issue that has some workarounds. Let me see if I can find it. If I can't find it in like 30 seconds or 45 seconds, then I'll send it out afterwards. But yeah, so it is possible. What essentially what happens is that you have to listen to everything and then see what matches up, if that makes sense. Because Cypress is intercepting network calls, but the way that GraphQL works is that because there's not specific endpoints for data. Instead, you're passing through whatever your query is, or I'm not sure the exact terminology, but then it gives you the response based on what data you're asking for. So there's not the way that like a REST API works, where you're saying if I go to post endpoint this, then I'm supposed to get a response. If I go to this endpoint this, it's supposed to get a response. So you do have to essentially just catch everything that's coming back and then see what matches up with your data. There is a workaround for it. I couldn't find it in 30 seconds while talking, so I think I can look that up though, and I can definitely get that to Marie so that she can send that link out, and I'll post it on Twitter as well once I find it. And that would be a really great blog post or something for our documentation as well. All right, so taking a look at some other questions here. It looks like there's some in the chat as well. So I'm gonna try and check is there. So if you could share your questions in the Slido, that's probably the easiest way for me to see it, because it looks like we do have quite a bit of questions. But next one is, when you run a group of tests in the CI, it runs sequentially or in parallel. Great question. So you can do either. So if you're running your tests in CI, it all depends on how you have it configured. You can run in parallel if you're using the Cypress dashboard. So we leverage smart parallelization that looks at all the history of your test runs, figures out the most efficient way to split that up across your machines, and then it runs the tests in parallel. So that's essentially something that happens within the Cypress dashboard. But when you set up your CI runs, you can do that yourself. It won't have the smart parallelization that Cypress does, and it's going to take a lot of additional configuration. But it's all dependent on how you set up your tests to run in CI. Cypress doesn't prevent you from doing anything in particular. And we have a lot of different examples. So we have, for example, we have Jenkins. We have, oh my gosh, so many. I can just actually, we have a whole continuous integration guide in our docs, which I use constantly to look at example configuration files. So I'm gonna just kind of pop this in the chat here. But there's an example section that has, yes, we have AWS Amplify, AppFire, Azure, Bitbucket, BuildKite, Circle CI, Concourse, GitLab, Jenkins, Travis CI, and these all have example configuration files for running in basic and then also running in parallel. Yeah, so you can make parallel tests. It does require additional configuration. Absolutely. That's kind of the thing I like about Cypress, is that like aside from some known trade-offs, if you want to do something, we can probably figure it out as long as it runs in a browser. So, okay, taking a look at the next question. I also want to make sure that we're doing okay on time too. So Marie, feel free to interrupt me if I'm going too long. So with apps developed in React and requests are window.fetch rather than XHR, any working examples of request call waits which are fetched in Cypress test. So there's a couple of workarounds. So currently, Cypress does not support fetch. That's something that's on our roadmap is full network stubbing. It's actually being actively worked on right now. But the workaround in the meantime is there's a couple different ways that you can approach it. We have it in our documentation. Let me see, actually, if I can find that exact link. So there is an experimental fetch polyfill. Ooh, that's tough to say. And I can send the blog post for that. Essentially, this is a precursor to full network stubbing, which is on the roadmap. But it allows you to essentially polyfill those fetch requests. You can also disable fetch entirely on the window, which will force everything to turn into XHR, and you can intercept it that way. But there's obviously some cases where that won't work, and so that's where the experimental fetch polyfill comes in. And this can be enabled right away, but it is experimental, so you have to turn it on. So that's something that you're interested in. You can definitely explore that. 15 minutes of Q&A. Okay, perfect. All right, so, okay, so next question here. From your experience, have you seen more software engineers, developers using Cypress or QA test engineers? It's actually, when I first started at Cypress, I thought that it would be more developers, but it's actually a lot. We actually have quite a bit of QA. I would say it's probably almost, again, this is anecdotal. I don't have like hard numbers, but just from the people that I interact with, I would say it's actually probably like almost a 50-50 split between developers and QA. I think there's a couple different reasons for that. You know, Cypress is, you have all that extra functionality because you can access Node and you can access the shell from within your test code. So I think developers like that you can do extra things with it. And then I think also for the QA aspect of it is Cypress is pretty easy to get up and running. We try to make the commands as syntactic as possible, as English-like as possible. And so I actually have seen a pretty even split between software engineers and QA. Is database a reserved name in Cypress? I don't think so. That's a good question. It's not an overwrite command. If you're referring to the Cypress commands, so if you wanted to actually, you can actually overwrite any existing command as well, leveraging custom commands. So say for sci.click, for example, and this is actually what cypress-movie does. Cypress-movie overrides certain Cypress commands and slows them down. So you can change the functionality of click to slow it down. You can change the functionality of any kind of command if you wanted it to do something specific whenever you do that. Are you creating real data in the database instead of mocking data? Yeah, so we are actually seeding the JSON database with real fake data every time. So and then the same thing happens when we're running transactions. So the reason that we reseed the database between every test is because when we have tests that update the database by creating transactions, updating profiles, different things, that is creating real data in the database. So it's testing that full functionality of our API in our application. So we can do both, right? You can mock responses if you don't need to test that functionality, but this is also creating real data in the database to make sure that that's working as well. So you can design your test suite around what you need to test and making sure that you're running tests for those things and not duplicating it when you don't need to. Yes, more developers. Yeah, so the that's a good, thanks Matt for kind of pointing out that context. So I do see, so I think probably everyone or people may have heard the term shift left, right? Where we see more developers writing tests that rather than having the test code, rather than having the software code written in isolation, throwing it over the wall, so to speak, to QA, and then the test code being written and run in isolation. We are seeing more collaboration between the two different teams. So sometimes I'll be on calls with people and it's like we have the engineers and the QA because they work together. I've seen different situations where, developers will write tests for new features, and then QA is responsible for writing, the tests for existing features, the smoke tests, the kind of edge cases. I've seen that kind of model before. So I think we definitely have seen, I think that maybe Cypress has a higher percentage of developers writing tests maybe than other tools. Again, that's kind of anecdotal. That's not hard data. Don't hold me to that. But I would say that I do see a little bit more adoption among developers, maybe with Cypress. What is the best way to get data test attribute to add an application? Good question. So we talked about that, right? So essentially, if you have access to your code base and you know which elements that you need to test, you can go into that HTML element. Let's say it is a link, and you just add, an attribute. So you can do data-sci equals login link, whatever it is that it's named. If you don't have access to the code base, it is tougher. So that's why I say if you're able to do this, it's a great best practice. Or if you don't have access to the code base and you're able to get developers to add those references in there for you, it essentially just allows you to be very prescriptive with what elements that you're querying for and you're getting back. So you don't have to worry if you have a certain class, for example, and it returns like 10 items, then you don't necessarily need to say, okay, I want the first one. You can just go directly to whatever that first one is, or you can go directly to the exact element of what's happening. So you always know that you're getting the right element that you want. Okay, great questions. I just want to just check the chat real quick and see if there's any additional. Okay, yeah, so looks like we have a bunch of new questions. If anybody wants to vote on questions too, see which ones that. Okay, is it possible to?
Cecelia, sorry, just to quickly interrupt you. So, because we only have 5 more minutes. At the end, we could just always collate the questions, because I'm curious about your time as well. So maybe what we could do is we could just answer a couple more, and then we can send the list of the other unanswered questions, and then just share it on like a Google Doc or somewhere. Then we can share it on the meetup group.
Perfect, and that'll give me a chance to get some of those resources that I mentioned that I couldn't find in 30 seconds. So,
yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, perfect. All right, great. Then yeah, so since we only have 5 minutes left, I do want to just kind of thank everyone for your time. And again, if you do have any questions, please submit them, to Marie. We'll get the question list together so I can respond. But again, I'm on GitHub as Cypress Cecelia for anything Cypress related. I'm also on GitHub as Cecelia Creates for all my personal projects. I do have a website, ceceliacreates.com, and then you can also reach me on Twitter. I love talking to people about Cypress and about just testing in general. So, and I love hearing people's experiences with it. So if you have any feedback, definitely feel free to reach out to me. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen and to ask great questions. You'll have some really great questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cecelia, for giving this wonderful session, in fact. So to be very honest with you, this is something that I really wanted to explore. So that was there in my bucket list, in fact. I tend to learn a lot about this particular real-world application as well. So once again, thank you so much for answering all the questions patiently. And thanks, everyone, for joining. And please do support us. And of course, we have next a few more sessions that are planned in the upcoming months as well. So please do join us and have fun. Thank you so much. Cheers, guys. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye again.
Bye.